one thing about writing is, and I'm not talking of a column writing here. I think that you become the sort of dissenting judge on a Supreme Court bench. You're writing for the future. You recognize that what you're saying may not make any kind of difference now, but it is for the years and the eyes of people who might be more in time aligned to what it is that you think.
Welcome to the Windowpane Sessions. Before we begin, a quick word about Windowpane. This is an online community of writers formed by participants of my online course, The Art of Clear Writing. We conduct workshops, give each other writing prompts and feedback, publish a newsletter at windowpane.substack.com, and so on. Starting today, we are beginning this new initiative in which we invite noted writers to come and chat with us about the craft and practice of writing. Our first guest is Akar Patel, who's been both a newspaper editor and a prolific columnist, and has written a bunch of yet to be released books, which he will hopefully tell us about. Akar, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Akar, you'd come on my podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, where we briefly discussed your early life and how you got into journalism. But what we did not discuss there, and what I kind of want to ask you about today, because it's relevant to writing, is at around what point did you start getting mindful of the craft of writing itself? Like, I remember that, when The God of Small Things came out, Arundhati Roy gave an interview where she spoke about how when she started writing a book, the quality of her reading changed. She would notice things about the craft specifically, the tricks that writers use, the things that they did. When did that become a conscious process for you, where you've kind of gotten into journalism and then you start actually noticing the writing itself?
I'd say the same thing, I think, more or less. All of us who are here on this show today are here because we find something interesting in the art of storytelling and how it's done. So, in some sense, we tend to look at the written word in a slightly deeper way than most people who are not actually interested in writing. But you only tend to develop a craft of your own when you start to write yourself. When you're faced and you're confronted with a paragraph that you have composed, and you are aware of what it is that other better writers have done before you, that is a beginning point. That is the real, actually, starting point of a writing. Your craft tends to come together at that point. There are some of us, very few, I would say, who have received an education in how to write at a very young age. People who may have been to Oxford or Cambridge, who have been exposed at the level of even the teacher or the tutor to very fine writing. But for most of us, myself included, the journey starts only when you start writing yourself.
And how does one sort of avoid the bad habits which are normalized in the newsroom of writing? I mean, for example, one of the things, like you sent us a note before you did this, and one of the things that you spoke about is that you just strive for your writing to be transparent, to be clear. In fact, the name of our group, Windowpane, derives from the old George Orwell quote: good prose should be like a window pane." And yet, a lot of the habits that are normalized in the way that we write in India, in the way that our newsrooms function, is very opaque prose, where sometimes it is almost a signal of sophistication to show off how many big words and how much jargon you know. So when do you start being able to filter out what are the bad habits and what are the good habits and so on?
I think for me, it came automatically in time. I was very show-offy as a writer without being good, and that's the worst kind of writer that you can be. You use the word opaque, and I think that's the right word to use.
Also, Akar, one of the sort of interesting things about your background is that you were also reading languages. Like, at one point, you told me in the episode we did together that you got fascinated by Urdu and you started learning Urdu and so on and so forth. How did your sort of knowledge and your reading habit in these languages, did that affect the way that you wrote in English, or and enhanced your appreciation for other aspects of language?
I think what it added was a fondness for etymology and my trying to use words in a context where they would be slightly more appropriate classically than they might be otherwise. This is difficult for me to explain, but I think once you start looking, there's a lovely website called Etym Online, ETYM online.com, which takes you back to the root of a word and tells you how it is that the word came to be. There's a book that Plato wrote also on words, and I think that um, trying to engage with a foreignness, it does tend to bring something to your language. So while it's true that learning languages as you grow old, when you're past your 20s and 30s, is tough, because the mind is not as plastic as a child's mind is. It's much easier for a 5-year-old, 6-year-old to learn a language than for a 50-year-old. But should you try it, and even if you don't get all the way through, if you just learned how to read, say, the Greek alphabet or the Arabic alphabet, just looking at some of the words will help you improve your writing for sure.
No, and it's remarkable. In fact, like Jhumpa Lahiri learned Italian from scratch as an adult and then wrote a book in it. And she did an interview with Tyler Cowen where she spoke about this other amazing writer she discovered. I don't know if you've read her, called Agatha Christophe, who I think during the war moved to France as an adult and wrote these remarkable novels there with just stripped bare prose, which is so powerful.
Yeah, I'm in awe of people like her. I think people like Conrad or like Nabokov, who not only are writing in a different language, but are writing fiction, which is very difficult to bring in somebody into fiction. If Dalrymple wrote fiction for the reader in Bombay, it would not be the same thing an as a Roy. There would be in some sense, it would be different. But to have these great writers and produce novels of the sort that they have is to me absolutely astonishing. I could not do it in a language that I didn't have firm control over, not only over the language itself, which would be a problem, but also over the material. I think that for fiction to be able to be close to a society, fiction reveals a society in a way that non-fiction doesn't. To have family life and relationships described in a foreign language is to me absolutely amazing.
During my course, I often talk about two aspects of writing. One, of course, is a craft of writing, and the other is the practice of writing, the discipline and how you build the writing habits and all of that. I want to ask you about a third aspect because I think it's kind of relevant, which is about the ethical aspect of writing. That would you say that in some way, in the kind of times that we live in, that the act of writing itself is an ethical act? That if you have something to express, if you feel dissent is important, and you have the capacity to write, then it is in fact your duty to write, and that will then also drive the form that your writing takes. Like the other thing that in your note you pointed out about writing needing to be clear, does that then become also an imperative in another way?
I think so. And I think that it's not, I don't know if the word is ethical. What happens is if you write enough, and I think I certainly write a lot, it's difficult to lie. You can't lie to yourself beyond the point. You can't lie to others. It becomes very difficult to write if you don't believe what it is that you are writing. You can do it as a press release. You can do it as some sort of brief for somebody else. But if you're continuously putting pen to paper every day, it is not possible for you to lie. You have to be made of very different material to be able to put out 500 words a day and not believe in what it is that you're doing. It could be bad writing. We are not talking about that. But I'm trying to connect what I'm saying to what you did, which is that if you're faced in a time when you need to respond to that time through your words, it's not possible for you to lie beyond the point. So you will be forced, if you do write in times of stress, you will actually be able to connect with whatever the quandary of your time is. And I think that's one of the greatest things about writing, that all of us who choose to write at whatever point in time, there is never a great a time in our part of the world, but we tend to reflect what it is that is going on around us in a way that is honest, and for me that is wonderful.
And before I go over to the questions, because I think there are many people waiting to ask questions, so I won't monopolize the time. But in your note, you also shared a little bit about your work habits, especially as you've been writing multiple books together. One, how hard it is to work on multiple books at the same time, and almost code shift from one to the other. And two, what are sort of your routines like, and how did you arrive at this routine? Like, what are your learnings through the process of crafting your practice of writing?
It's not that difficult for me. So I have currently one book which is finished, one book which is about half done, and one book which is about a third done. And I don't have a problem shifting myself from one book to the other. I do have because I'm not very patient, I do have a problem going back to words that I have already written. So for me, the hardest part is the engagement with the editor, where I need to reread thousands of words that I've just read last week once more. And I'm not really that much in love with my own writing that I would like to go through it. But I think it is a moral obligation on you to be able to force yourself through it. So I think that separation for me between what I have already written and what I am writing is quite clear, and it's more difficult for me to do the former than the latter. But as I've written in my note, I write through the day. So for me, whenever I'm struck by an idea, when you love something, and I love this, it's you keep coming back to it, and there's no real effort that is actually required. So for me, separation is fairly easy. My content is not that different. What I write, one book is on the constitutional history of South Asia. The other book is on the modern history of this country. The third book is on how to protest and why to me, these three are not really different. It's just the lens. One is a slightly longer lens, one's a short lens, and one is the lens of now. So yeah, so in terms of purely in terms of content and thinking, they would be linked.
Right. So I'll move on to the questions now. And the first question we had lined up is from Isha, who doesn't seem to be here. So I'll ask the question on her behalf, and she can watch it later in the recording. And her question to get started off was this is from Isha Zaveri. And she asks, whose writing has inspired you over the years? Did you mimic or follow a certain style before discovering your own voice?
So I used to write for a tabloid for a really long time, which was a sort of comic column. And for that, I think I took on the language of Bombay's writers, especially Behram Contractor and Manto. Both of them were quite direct and rude in many ways. And I think Bombay is that sort of place where the informality of the city itself, it's a city of strangers very close to one another, smelling each other's armpits, on the train and so on. So it produces that kind of writing. So that was one that was for my light newspaper writing. But for the last 30 years, I've been following the reading, maybe not for the last 2-3 years, but certainly for about 25 years, I've been reading a man in Lahore called Khalid Ahmed, who was a newspaper editor in the 80s, Urdu language newspaper. In the late 80s, he took on English. He spoke Russian. He was a diplomat for a few years out of Moscow. Very deep understanding of the subcontinent and its cultures, very deeply rooted in the West and its music and so on. So I was immensely influenced by him, by his thinking. His writing is very, very good. But again, it's Napoleon in the way that most writers who come into writing recognize that this is a style they can live by. They will never be able to write as well as Naipaul. But I think what he's trying to do through his prose, most try to copy. And I think that between these three writers, I've tried to figure out how best it is that I can write a sentence. One thing I should say here is that because I write so much, it's not possible for me to reflect on the quality of writing as much as it would be for somebody who wrote a little less. I used to write a lot of columns till many of them got dropped, but that was like a column a day, column every day and a half. So that you're knocking off 1,000 words a day. At some point, it tends to become default. So you're not spending that much time thinking about the quality of a writing. And I can look back to a lot of my writing and maybe even most of my writing and feel that a lot should have been different. But when you write a lot, one of the things that you do is it tends to become so easy that you don't tend to spend too much time on it. I would write an 800-word column in about 40 minutes, and that's the pace I normally keep. Yeah.
Okay, that's insane. I just want to tell everyone else that this is one of those do not try this at home moments because very few people can manage this. The next question is from Brijesh. Brijesh, I'm promoting you to a panelist.
Hello, Akar. Good
Hi.
evening.
Good evening.
Yes, I had 3 questions for you, Akar, but I'll ask one for now, and then I'll come back to it later for the
Sure.
other questions. So my first question was that with you and many other writers that we read, especially after this course, a lot of it is about opinion writing and column writing, and a lot of it is invested, just like you said just now about highlighting things that you think are important at this in these times and in these situations. So, do you as a writer feel disappointed if those opinions do not get traction? Like when, especially when the opinions are sometimes something you consider very important for society at the time.
That's a great question. I you can't do that. So there are two parts to this. One is whether you get any kind of traction at all from anybody. You could, you know, write a letter and put it in the post box and nobody ever read it. So that's one sort of traction. The other sort of traction is that the subject that you're writing about is discussed and debated, but it's dismissed. So what usually happens for people who are confronted with subjects as of the sort that I write on, it's the latter, that you tend to write stuff which has no impact. So I'll give you an example that doesn't concern me, but the non-profit organization that I used to work for is evidence-based. So they would do a 3-year research paper on something and then give it to the government and ask the government to look at the data and then try and correct either law or a policy. The state in India does not engage with that. So you could produce all the data you wanted to demonstrably prove that a law or a policy was harming the country, but you would not get any kind of traction from the state. So I think that while I haven't faced the first kind of crisis, which is that nobody reads you at all and nobody cares, I have and constantly face the second kind, which is that whatever you write about doesn't make any serious impact. But one thing about writing is, and I'm not talking of a column writing here, I think that you become the sort of dissenting judge on a Supreme Court bench. You're writing for the future. You recognize that what you're saying may not make any kind of difference now, but it is for the ears and the eyes of people who might be more in time aligned to what it is that you think.
Our next question is from Ravi. Ravi, I'm just about to make you a panelist.
Hi, Akar. So good to have you in this show. Akar, I have obviously read a lot of what you have said, and my question is about you see how these times are about a lot of polarization, and I'm looking for a good simple message to be going out to the masses, right? To counter the divisive agenda that you see everywhere. The liberal voices, those who are on the secular side, etc., come off as very thought through, sophisticated. Whereas what I think needs to work for the masses is something simple. The simple stories that we used to see in the 80s. And my question to you is it possible to bring the strong secular narrative back in fashion? How do we do that?
I think so. I think that's the norm on the subcontinent. If you were to travel to Bangladesh or to Sri Lanka, Nepal, any part of India, any part of Pakistan, this is how a society actually is. What you see on the Twitter is not what you see on the streets. We tend to amplify the violence in terms of, let's say, if there's a lynching episode, it tends to become national news. But what is happening on our streets at this point in time, outside my house and your house, doesn't really reflect the kind of anger and the kind of a confrontation we see elsewhere. And you're dead right. I think there is a very large middle. Any kind of campaigning works on that middle, that you will make a set of 3 groups of people. One who are on your side, who you don't need to talk to. One who are absolutely on the other side of the divide, you might want to speak to them. But there's a third set of people who are not really there or here. You're trying to bring them towards yourself. Any kind of campaigning is based on that third set of people. So I think that any conflict, anything, whether it's the Chennai Super Kings versus the RCB, whether it is India versus Pakistan, whether it is whatever else, any kind of conflict will have a large number of people in the middle who don't really have any stake or too much stake in, or too much skin in that game and are willing to be convinced one way or the other. The best way of doing it, and I would actually agree with you, is to popularize your narrative and make it simpler. Easier said than done. Trying to communicate simple things in simple words is very difficult. I think the Prime Minister does it really well. What it does is it opens you up to a simplification and a simplified takedown of what you're saying as well. The reason why academic writing is so dense is that it doesn't leave too much space for it to be opposed. It tends to operate in chess type fashion, that there's a logic that actually drives the words. If your writing is loose, and by loose I mean simplified, conversational, it's easier to pick holes in it. And so one reason why many people speak in kind of less simple terms than they should is this, that they don't want their argument to be taken apart by folksy logic. So I think that while the Prime Minister is exceptional at communicating, he'd be terrible in a debate, because when you simplify things down to the level where to the level that he does, you expose yourself to the attack of facts. So there's a lot to be said about why we should do this, and some things to be said about why it is difficult.
Our next question is from Gautam.
Hi, Akar. It's really a pleasure to be able to put a question across to you. I got introduced to your writings from reply to all columns in main college. So I have 5 questions, but I'll just ask one of them right now. Let us take your columns in reply to all. I liked them very much, but the reaction on reading your columns was like downing 2 undiluted pigs. The first urge is there for retching, and followed by the subsequent understanding as it sinks in. But one of the recurrent themes in your writings is that there is a labeling that you do. For example, thoughts like we all Indians label a bachelor to be honest, by which he explained our Prime Minister's popularity. Then Gujus mean business, Bong means culture, stand for culture. Pakistan, you explained how the martial class is all that is left, because the business class, which was primarily Hindu community, left during partition. Then presently you make us appreciate the different baniyas, the local baniya versus the global baniya, the then partidars and so on. So in a deeply divided society of ours, where us talk English class have where we have internalized these caste distinctions, we feel very ruffled by such ideas being vocalized by anyone when we read them. But your articles seem to stress on a certain eugenics, as if it is in the blood. So how does one reconcile with the ideas that you force us to face? Where do we put this segregation, which seems to be a trademark of our nation, where there are so many boundaries which we are unable to, or which are part internalized by us? What is the right place where we put these demarcations of ours?
So I wouldn't say it's a eugenics or a genetic. I would say that what I had written about was about culture, which is a vague word, which tends to be ignored in academia. So when you look at when you study, say, the army, and how it is that it does its recruitment in Pakistan, and how it is different here. When you look at the list of people who made, let's say, $1 billion, which was not passed on to them, who are these people? Where do they come from? It seemed to me, when I started writing that column, that there was not enough work being done on it, and it was just assumed that this is the way the world was. That certain communities, so for instance, Gujarat and Haryana have the lowest sex ratio, gender ratio of women to men. Why is that the case?
Right.
And is it true of Gujarat and of the state as a whole, or certain communities within that state? And if the answer is it is certain communities, which communities and why? So I think these are the kind of questions that I was really interested in looking at from the point of view of learning. I think a lot of the writing that I did in that period was to teach myself and to ask myself why it is that the world is the way it is. I think writing has given me the opportunity to make a living out of trying to figure the world out. That a lot of us might have, frustration with things, but very few of us get paid to actually ask ourselves formally, why is this the case, and to try and look at some material. So I think I came out of that background, and that column gave me the opportunity to do that. Would I write like that now? I think that when you write a lot, and I started writing that column when I was in my late 30s. I'm now 50. You tend to, over long periods of time, develop a different style. So I think that for me now, writing columns is very difficult. I was just telling my wife yesterday in the morning that I didn't feel motivated to write a column that I had a deadline for. I only have 1 or 2 now a week, but even that that's hard for me to write, because my interest is in writing longer form, to write a book rather than to write a column. So what you speak about, and really accurately, and thank you for that, was a part of my life when I was trying to discover some stuff, which I did, and I had a lot of fun doing it.
Great. Thank you.
The next question is from Pratibha.
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
So my question is, what role does writing play in formulating your opinion about an issue or an incident? So do you have your thoughts, your beliefs sorted out before you start putting them down on paper? Or does writing become a part of your research?
Very good question. I think both tend to happen, that you're writing about something because you have an interest in something, and you have to be invested in some way, one side or the other, on that. But once you do start writing, and especially if you write it at length or at depth, you tend to take on information from the other side, and then that tends to change the way that you view something. I think for me, growing up in a sort of Hindu middle class kind of background, my view of Muslims and of Pakistan was very fixed, and I wrote a lot about it when I was very young, in my 20s. And the view really changed in time when I was forced to look at the other side, because once you start writing, unless you're really dumb and you want to repeat the same thing, over and over again, you want to broaden the writing by trying to see what it is that you've missed out on. That is the moment in which you're forced to confront the other side of the argument and look at it. So I'd say both things happen. You tend to go into it with a view, but then once you start writing, that view tends to change.
And the next question is from Sanjay.
Thanks, Akar, for doing this. It's good to see you.
Sure.
This is a related question to your previous answer. This is about how do you deal with changing your thoughts or changing your mind, or how your thinking evolves. We all the time we get new information. Our thinking evolves. We read, but everything you say, everything is out there, etched in the memory of the internet. And people always either say you're a turncoat, or on the other end of the spectrum, people just double down on what they've said in the past and refuse to evolve their thinking. So it's about how do you develop a bit of an intellectual humility to be able to say, hey, I was wrong, and I used to think this, but this is how I've changed.
You say it exactly in the way that you actually just said it now. And I think that people who write often tend to be intellectually honest. It's not possible for you to keep lying to yourself if you write regularly. And there is no real a problem with going to the world and saying that I was wrong about something. That's absolutely fine. I think that the sign of learning, evolution, and of the mind expanding. One of the things is that, especially if you write polemics, strongly worded, one-sided arguments, the chances are that you might get some things wrong or many things wrong. And I think the best way of moving ahead and of learning is to tell yourself first that I think that I was wrong here. And these are the reasons why I was wrong. Most times we are wrong not because of a lack of fact. I think most times we are wrong not because we made a mistake, but because we didn't look at it deeply enough, that we didn't observe the other material that was contradicting our polemic. And I think that it's honest and easy to do. I don't think any writer has the kind of problem of having this burden over their shoulder that they can't take it off because they once said it or they wrote it 5 or 10 years ago.
Do you remember anything on which you were wrong about and quickly
Many,
change your mind?
many things that I was wrong about. Too many for me to start listing. But I think that one of the things that writing does as you become older is that it makes you more circumspect about how wildly you will say something. You might still say it, but I'm saying that you might qualify it by sort of adding something else, because in your heart that it might not necessarily be true, or that it might hurt somebody beyond the point that you want them, So you tend to be more restrained in time because you've seen what the damage of what your words can do to the external world. Words can do great damage. You can dishearten somebody by writing about them in a way that you might not actually believe. I think most of us who write are not faced with our own selves being written about in the way that we write about others, except perhaps when you find book reviews and things like that, where for the most part it's quite gentle. But if you're writing non-fiction, if you're writing a polemical stuff, you're doing much more damage to the world than you think you are. And I think in time you tend to realize that.
And if I might add my own little thought to that, there was an interesting thread by Annie Zaidi recently on how all human beings are a work in progress, which is something was almost a trope of mine at one point, and which is why I think that on the internet we spend too much time talking about people and too little time talking about ideas and policies and so on and so forth. And this whole personalization of the discourse has just become incredibly toxic, where it is within your own, like Akar spoke about, how there's a vast silent majority which can be convinced, which is open to dialogue, but we don't see them. They are unseen in a sense because of these vocal minorities that are engage in tribalism on social media. So and it's there that people are trying to raise their status within their own in groups by kind of attacking people on the other side. And I always find that that's very toxic, that whenever you engage in a discussion you should focus on the argument and not the person. And that's one of the things that even inhibits me from sometimes posting things on social media that I know will probably be attacked by both sides, and why kind of get into that. But anyway, that's an aside. We'll move on now to a question from Raj.
Hi, thank you for doing this.
Sure.
Akar, I have a question that's in the vein of what Amit just spoke. It really speaks to the times we live in and the act of writing in response to it. As someone who writes and also who stands fiercely against polarization, do you fear that our conversations tend to happen in bubbles? For instance, when we are critical of hate politics and speak of certain values, and that's just one example, I sometimes fear whether we are preaching to the converted. If that's the case, how does a writer or an artist or a filmmaker seek to move beyond these bubbles? Does it change the way you write, for instance?
I think that there is some sort of training that is done in non-profits that all of us would actually benefit from. what I spoke about earlier about that middle and how to convince them, there is actually theory on this written down, many books, which talk about how it is that you can bring about change in a society or a change in law. And there is a method in the way that it has been done around the world. So I think that one of the things that I didn't know about this as being a theory till I joined a sort of civil society organization. So you have to be able to figure out technically how to win a victory on the issue that you care about, whether it's gay marriage or whether it is, the CAA or like whatever else. And what are the steps that lead to that victory? There might not be steps that can actually be executed properly in the short term, but that's fine. Many of these battles are fought over years.
Right.
But to look at it as a battlefield, that's why it's called a campaign. It's like you have to, it's, a Caesarean. You're on your horse and there's an army in front of you, and you need to figure out how best, I mean, there's no violence, obviously, but how is it that you convince that set of people who don't have any kind of stand either on your side or the other. They are the softest targets. If you reach out to them and bring them over to you, that's and make your side larger, that's how it starts. I would say that we live in an exceptional time. This would not have been possible 15 years ago. I think social media is phenomenal. It adds a phenomenon in a way that was not possible. There was no way 99% of the people of the world had any voice 15 years ago, or maybe 20 years ago, There was no, you could write a letter to a newspaper. That was it. For the vast majority of people, there was no access to any kind of a public debate. One fallout of that, as we've seen, is the nastiness that we sort of perceive on social media. But the benefits far outweigh that nastiness. It is usually the marginalized that don't get heard. If you have a very strong state, like you have in our part of the world, it is only one side that gets spoken about. When we had Doordarshan only, it is only that voice that you will hear. In the country that we live in today, it's mostly the mainstream media that supports the state, and there are 2-3 reasons why it does so. The voice out of the media, the mainstream media, it seems to be quite a majoritarian and supportive of the state. It is only in the social media space that there is some element of pushback. So while it is the case that it's quite nasty and can get depressing to be engaged, it's wonderful in the sense that it's the only space that many people have and have not had it before 20 years. So I think look at that space, try and get that middle. If you're really passionate about change, there are many ways in which the steps that bring that change are to be sought and found. And I'll be very happy to help in setting you up in some sort of reading should you want any specific issue. But Greenpeace and Amnesty, groups like that, they have very long, years-long sort of campaigns on trying to bring about change.
That'd be great. Just a very quick follow-up, because something that you just spoke about, the mainstream media, connected it in my head to what is happening in non-mainstream media, where people are, where organizations are going the subscription model, which is in a way a good thing, because we are paying for news, or well, in some cases paying for somebody's views. But even there again, the fear is of confirmation bias, because people who, at least my fear is that only people who tend to think a certain way would subscribe to an organization like The Wire, while there would be people who think a certain way, however much I may disagree with them, who would subscribe to an Op India.
I think that that's true to some extent, but I think when you're faced with a polarization where one side says that we should ask millions of people to prove their citizenship and lock up those who can't to the satisfaction of the state, I don't think that's a kind of he said, she said, or I don't think there is any kind of moral argument in favor of saying that.
Sure.
And I don't think anybody in the world outside of this country would actually, well, not anybody, but most people who would look on it would see one side as doing something wrong. But I think it's okay in this sort of circumstance for you to seek refuge in the media that would kind of echo your voice. It's necessary, I think, for your own sanity. You can't be engaging with madness of the sort that we are seeing unfold in this country. The state is very weak in India. The state doesn't have it within itself to be able to resist either mass violence. Episodes of mass violence break out really easily. Justice is really difficult to find. If the state chooses to go down a path, it's difficult to get it to change its mind because it itself doesn't have the power to be able to do that nimbly. So we should be resisting strongly and using whatever resource we have. And if one of those resources is, supporting those publications that sort of echo our voice, I think that's absolutely fine.
Right. Thank you, Akar.
And our next question is sort of in a way related. This was submitted by Chintan Patel, who is not able to attend this session. So I'll ask it on his behalf. Chintan had a couple of questions. I'll ask them both, and they're sort of related. Question number one is, do you have an intended audience in mind when you write a column? Is your target audience of faithful readers who are likely to share your view, folks who are likely to disagree, or neither? And the second question is it important for you that your column adds something novel to the public discourse on any given issue? Or is a column a vehicle to share your views, irrespective of the novelty or ubiquity of content?
Amit, I didn't hear the second question. I'll just answer the first one first. It depends on what column it is and what newspaper it is for. So in India, on the subcontinent, actually, we've had this tradition for many decades of column writers who are folksy. So you're this sort of uncle who's talking about his morning tea and whatever else. So there are people in Pakistani papers or in Hindi papers, Gujarati papers that write 3 or 4 columns in the same paper every week. So it's just on Tuesday they'll write about the TV not working and they called the guy to fix it, and things are really bad. On Wednesday the rains fell and the terrace got flooded, etc. So it's a communication more of life. And this is a very classical South Asian column writing tradition where the depth is quite shallow, but it's wide. You can be writing about Wimbledon and the fact that you're seeing more African Americans on the court, or you could be writing about nuclear physics and something happening there. You don't have any kind of expertise in any of this, but you're just trying to, what you read about last night, you will write about this morning. So that's one kind of column. The other kind of column, which is a polemic, is an argument that you say, for instance, that India handled COVID much worse than sort of the rest of South Asia or the rest of the world. So there, I think it's more, so you need 2 things. You need some data, and you need to be able to explain why the data reads the way it does. So these are the 2 sorts of things I normally do. It tends to come very easily to you once you do it. Writing is like jogging. It's like running. The more the doing it is actually both the art and the craft and the practice and the output. There is nothing else. You just sit and you write. So for me, column writing in this country is, I think, much easier and shallower than it is in some parts of the world. So I think that, and it's meant to be that way. So in the 19th century, you had Dickens's novels were all written actually as columns. So he would write one sort of episode once a Sunday and then write now. A lot of it here is that way as well. It's one gigantic life story with several chapters. And I didn't hear your second question, Amit.
Yeah, no. Before that, a quick follow-up. I keep sort of commiserating with my participants and telling them that don't worry, writing is extremely hard for me as well. And now you make it sound so incredibly easy. Has it ever been hard for you? Like what are the aspects of writing or the sort of writing tasks that you've given yourself which actually have been difficult and haven't quite flowed?
So I think that the reason I write really quickly is that I do most of the material gathering before I sit down. So if I'm going to write on, say, let's say I'm writing a chapter tomorrow on something, I will make sure that I've read about it in depth and taken notes in depth before I even turn the computer on. Because when I turn the computer on, I don't want to face the screen and say, what's the next line? So the process would be to have a framework. Within that framework, to have the arguments laid out, starting, ending. if, when I make a speech, this is something I saw in a movie. It's a movie or a book. I can't really remember. It said that I'm going to tell the audience what I'm going to tell them, and then I tell them, and then I finish by telling them what I told them. So that's it. That you're clear about what you're trying to communicate. A paragraph has to link to the one that precedes it, and you have to move the writer from point A to point B. That I'm going to try and convince you that these 500 words mean this. I think once you are clear about that, writing becomes easy, unless you are trying to craft something of beauty, which I normally don't do because I can't. So for me, I write very conversationally. I write the way I speak. So I'm mindful when I write of not sounding particularly formal, and I try and get the reader as quickly through the paragraph as I can. But for that to happen, I need to know what it is that I'm trying to tell them. So, but that happens before I sit down to write. I've got my notes, and so that I don't know whether that makes it easier for like other people, but it certainly makes it very easy for me once I start to actually do the typewriting stuff. Yeah.
I'll move on to Chintan's second question, where he asks, is it important for you that your column adds something novel to the public discourse on any given issue? Or is the column a vehicle to share your views irrespective of the novelty or ubiquity of content? And I guess another way of asking this question would be that, are you, does the tyranny of an impending deadline ever affect your content? Like there was a time I remember you were incredibly prolific. You were writing 3-4 columns a week, TOI, Business Standard, and so on. And is there a time where you feel like you don't really have anything to say, like in column likhna hai? So, how do you deal with that?
No, I normally prepare my writing the day before. So whatever angst I have to go through has to happen the night before I go through it. Also, I think if you take your own writing slightly lightly, you can switch subjects and do something which sort of other more formal writers can't. If you don't take yourself too seriously, you can actually slip in on a very tough week where you worked on something which didn't work out. I think that's the worst part. It's not really that you can't think of anything. It's that what you thought of is so bad that you can't really stretch it beyond 150 words to 500, leave alone 800. So the problem of writing lies there. It's not blankness so much as like badness, which is not really good enough to be able to be made better. I think on those days you need to write about something completely different. That's what I would do. So for the TOI column, I would write something humorous, which would be very bad to most people who were actually expecting me to write something about Pakistan or China or whatever. But the one thing, going back to what you said earlier, was that I think you owe it to the reader to be able to at least get them to finish those 800 words. Whether or not they agree, disagree, or whatever is fine. I'm saying that you need, if they are bored, that's the worst thing. You're occupying space that goes at 1,000 rupees a square centimeter or whatever it is. That's really, really an expensive space in a newspaper. You need to make sure that you give that person their value's worth when they sort of engage with you. Yeah.
In fact, it's not just a space; it's a reader's time and attention, which is of so
Absolutely.
much value.
No question.
Which is why all my participants are tired of hearing me say that bad writing is actually bad behavior. You're being rude to the reader who has,
Indeed,
privileged you with the time and attention. The next question is a related question to what you just said. It's by Harshil Shah, and he's again not present, so I will ask it on his behalf. The question is, how do you decide which stories to tell? To what extent do your personal values factor into the decision-making process?
So very, very good question. I think that it was different 10 years from now when I would write about sort of anything that caught my fancy. How is it that the AK-47 is the most popular gun in the world? How did rocketry begin? Whatever. It would be random stuff that I read about, which would be fascinating. But in the last 10 years, especially in the last 5 years, it's become very narrow. It's because I spent a term in a non-profit organization. I learned many things. One of the good things for me in terms of experience and the gathering of material is that I've worked in very different fields. I worked for 5 years in textiles in Surat. I worked for newspapers in Bombay. I worked for a Gujarati newspaper in Ahmedabad, which is a very different thing. I worked then for 5 years for a business in Bombay that I set up. Then for 5 years, I did nothing. I was at home, reading and writing all day. Then for another 5 years, I worked for this non-profit. So I was able to getting a lot of material. And for a writer, that's priceless, because you know a subject at some depth. This is, like a novelist must know the way that people in the village behave with one another, how it is that romance happens, how it is that family conflict happens. I think that if you were to sort of expand that to the non-fiction side, how it is that government works, how it is that rights violations are pursued, how to raise money. I think that these are fantastic things to learn. So in the last 5 years, I don't write about things that I'm personally not actually I'm invested in anymore. So all my 3 books are on similar subjects. The lens might be slightly different, but for me it is now to engage with the state on the issue of rights, to make sure that we are the kind of country that reflects the constitution, which we seem to be drifting away from. And to me, that's really the important bit now.
The next question is going to be from Prasanna.
Yeah, so Amit, I think the question is from other Prasanna, so I think you have to ask the question.
Okay, I'm sorry, there are multiple Prasannas.
Thanks for giving me the opportunity anyways. Thank you.
So I'll ask the question on Prasanna's behalf. Just give me a moment. Yeah, and it's a question that Prasanna's question is one that was in fact on my mind, Akar, to ask you, which is 2 questions, and I think they both are kind of related. So I'll ask them both, but I'll ask them one by one. Question number 1. Do you get to read, consume writing as much as you would like ideally? Or does writing/creating limit your reading by putting time or topic constraints on it? As in, do you only have the time to read what you need in order to write what you have to? I think what he's basically asking is that, do you have time to read for leisure? And also, if I can add to that, to go back to what you were earlier saying, where you were talking about how your wealth of experiences of doing all these different things sort of broadens your worldview and perspective. And obviously reading does that as well. So is that something you're conscious of, and something that do you make an effort to read as widely as you can?
I read through the day. Unfortunately, I think the modern time is bad for people like me, because it's very distracting. The social media is so beautiful. It's so wonderful in terms of being able to attach you to what it is that you like, the things that you like reading about, or the people that you like talking to, that it can pull you away from things that you might want to do, otherwise long form reading. I have held that sentiment for a long time. Now I've just surrendered to it. It's not possible for me to stay away from Twitter, say, and unless I'm writing in the morning. I spend some time reading stuff that is thrown up by Twitter, because it tends to speak to me. Do I read stuff that is unrelated to my writing? Yes, quite a lot. I have a room which is behind this one, which has bookshelves which have books on disparate subjects, the history of salt, the history of the screw, things like that, random wacky stuff that you can just pick up, and the Battle of Trafalgar or whatever. So I like reading that sort of thing. I think it's the usual middle class kind of GK type person. Like you like knowing about the world in a way that a lot of people around the world don't actually. This is quite a middle class Indian trait, that you pride yourself about knowing nonsense that won't really help you in any way, but it's conversationally good, and it sort of makes the world a much more sort of interesting place.
And Prasanna, second question, which is related, I guess, is that how does one know that the research one has done for an article on a topic one isn't an expert on is enough? Like he says, I feel like the more I read on a topic, the more ignorant I feel about it, and every step along the way is a rabbit hole to immerse myself in. So how do you know when to stop the research?
Very easy. What you need to do is only sort of identify who the best people who have written on the subject before you are, and look at their argument. That's how academic writing works. You have to build on what has come before you. There is no subject on earth that is completely a virgin soil. There will be somebody who will have plowed through it before. What you ought to know and be mindful of is who are the better people who worked on this before you. everything will be there. I think that you'll just need to either re-look at the way that they've said it and add something to it, or take it forward in some way. So this is not really difficult. If you have a subject that you are engaging in at some level of depth, you will know who the people who are very good at it. Yeah.
Great. The next question is from Harita. Harita, I'll just make you a panelist.
Hi, Akar.
Hi.
So my question is, like when you write, so when you explore the world, are there any phases where you felt disillusioned with it? And if so, how do you maintain optimism and sanity? And has there been any phase where you felt like not writing?
I think that I had that before I started writing, like 18 years ago. Three of us from the Editors Guild went to Gujarat to look at the media's role in the violence there. And I spent some time there with my friends, both of whom are now dead. Padgaonkar, who was the editor of the Times, and Varghese, who had been the editor of Hindustan Times. And it was awful to be confronted with violence. I think that the way that people tend to engage with communal violence in this country, especially for people in the middle class like us, we have very little direct exposure to it. We'll learn of it through the media, or we might know of some place that was burned down. This time, I think, that time in 2002, it required me to engage with people who had had their limbs chopped off, who had lost their son or their daughter or their mother, and this happened within days of their loss. And it was not easy for us to put that report together. I didn't expect, I didn't sort of anticipate the violence in that year. And being the editor of a newspaper, I was confronted every day, every evening, with a front page that I would have to make with news that I didn't want to engage with at all. I think that was the only period. But that for me, that was a learning. I think that when you tend to accept the bad things that are part of your country, then it becomes easier to write about them. It's still not sort of joyous, there's no joy in doing it, but I think it's more meaningful. We should be fortunate, those of us who are writing, all of us here, that we have the opportunity to be able to observe society in turmoil in a way that European writers would only have done a century ago. European writers don't have the material anymore, because they're living in societies where things that we see, being 94 in terms of malnutrition, to have 40% of your children stunted at the age of 5, to have civic violence normalized. These are things that writers would die for. Europe doesn't have this. The material is here. It shouldn't make us happy, but it's very difficult to disengage from it as writers. We have to engage with it on Twitter, in columns, in books, whatever form the output takes. I think Twitter can be much more meaningful than a book. I think that's true. You're far more likely to be able to convince 5,000 people today at this moment in time, whatever time it is, 7 o'clock, by putting out a tweet that gets retweeted and maybe 5,000 people change their minds, or at least change some part of their minds because of it. Will never happen from a book. Books are in some sense a vanity. You're trying to put something out at length of what you're trying to achieve, which is a change in a society, is much simpler, much more doable through social media if it's done in intelligent fashion.
Books are a vanity, says a man who's just written 3 books. We'll move on now to Darshan has a question.
Hi, Akar. So,
Hi.
Firstly, I would want to say that your writing in 2005 has changed my views about a lot of things, because it made me more liberal. It led me to question a lot of things, because I was very young, and I used to get mint launch at my home, and yours were the only article which used to question a lot of things. So thank you so much for that. My question is around killing your birds. So as a writer, if a sentence is really beautiful, we were taught in the writing class that you're supposed to kill them because it would actually distract your readers. So how often do you do that? And the second is, do you collate all these beautiful sentences which you have written, and then you go back to them later in some other articles you write, which is more in sync with these beautiful sentences you have written?
I think that when you have grasp over some sort of complicated fact and you want to communicate it in as direct a manner as possible, the phrasing is important and it is repeated. So when I sort of understand something which I think is in some ways special, or maybe I don't know, in some ways easier to explain to others, I will repeat that phrase somewhere else. Having said that, I don't think I'm a particularly sort of elegant writer. And so for me, holding on to paragraphs that I've written in the past is not really a thing. I mean, I don't, like I said at the beginning, the hardest part of writing for me is to reread the book that I just wrote last month, So I think it's more difficult for people who are genuinely sort of elegant. I think when you get somebody like Arundhati Roy on this show, it would be fascinating even for me to know how it is that she's able to compose. Does she go back to the writing? If she goes back to the writing, when? Does she go back the same day? Does she go back the next day? These are things that are published in this series of interviews called the Paris Review. So there are 4 books which are sort of available, I think, on Amazon, or they should be, which are long form interviews with writers only on writing. Where do you write? What time of the day do you write? Do you drink before you write? Do you write every day? How many words? Blah blah blah. So that really, reading that sort of thing gives you a great deal of confidence on how to negotiate your own craft. For me, letting go of lines that are pretty is very easy.
Actually, the phrase darshan is killing your darlings, not killing your birds. And in fact, that series of interviews in Paris Review is called the Writers at Work series. So for everyone who signs up for this course as part of their reading list, it's like linked from their show notes and so on.
There's 2 more books that are sort of related. Well, it's a set of 2 books. It's called Daily Rituals. So if you are sort of on Kindle, it looks at the daily rituals of writers. It's not an interview. So the material is not coming from the writer. It's somebody having written about them previously. But that's also fascinating. Daily rituals.
Superb. We shall look that up. And the next question is from Jahnavi. Jahnavi, I'm just promoting you to a panelist.
So, my question is pertaining to feature writing and long form journalism. What are your thoughts about that? Who do you follow? Because when it comes to feature writing, we kind of look at both the sides. It's not opinions per se, it's a lot of reportage. So
I think it's probably the most important form of journalism we have today. A lot of the work that Amnesty did in terms of either the Delhi riots or Kashmir or the CAA and the NRC would be what you would actually consider to be long form writing. It's 6, 8, 10 months of work and 12, 15,000 word piece. So I think, to my mind, it is Caravan, to some extent Scroll, Wire. There could be publications on the other side as well. I don't know, but to my mind, this is the most important journalism to be done in this time. Why? Because the only other thing that's happening, forget television, is that on the side of newspapers, there is no longer the kind of investment or even interest being made in things that would require episodic and serialized work. It's only in a very few places that this is actually happening. And the level of depth that the reporter needs to be able to get into to be able to talk about something like the Delhi riots cannot be done in like 800 or 1,000 word pieces. It can't be done by columnists, can't be done by me. It has to be done by feature writers. I don't know whether if that word, because that word is so rich and it is so vast, feature writing could be anything. There's a guy called McPhee, who was a feature writer who wrote a book who wrote an article that became a book on what was it? Oranges. So it's like he wrote maybe a 9,000 word piece, which sort of became a 30,000 word book. But I think that feature writing, to my mind, is where I would be were I to be a young journalist today.
And a quick follow-up question on that, Akar, that are you ever tempted to sort of, you were an editor for a significant period of time. Are you ever tempted to be an editor again, guide young journalists, get more of this work done? Like, in a sense, the work of descent through writing could gather more scale that way if you were editing rather than being one person writing yourself.
No, I like writing too much, and I've made some money, so I don't need to do a job. So for me, getting up in the morning, doing 4 hours of writing, I actually love doing it. It's like if my wife and I are at a party, I'm like, I hope we can get back home soon so I can write some notes. So when you love something that much, it's not easy for you to be able to let go. I had a great time in newspapers, but I think that time also was a different one. Like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was an editor with a broadsheet, or 20 years ago with a tabloid, newspapers themselves were quite different in what they meant to a society. I think social media has taken that apart comprehensively. One, in terms of the access to information, not just locally, but sort of around the world. Secondly, the two-way conversation, which doesn't exist with the newspaper.
Right. We'll on the subject of how you like taking notes and all that, I think a lot of these guys would love to know, is there a specific note-taking app that you use? How do you organize your material? Like, I've just discovered this incredible app called Rome Research, which I'm really excited about right now. But do you use anything?
No, it's quite dangerous actually. I just open a draft of like the email and start banging out on that directly, and it's sort of very easy to do. When I feel that I've got too much material in that one draft, which I can't really afford to lose, I mail it to myself, and then I sort of copy it and I start working on it one more time just in case. And there's a date on top so that I know how sort of updated it is. But for me, it's very easy because my phone's always with me. Ideas about writing come through the day. So whenever there's even if there is a phrase that I think communicates something better, even if it's just 5 words, I'll stop what I'm doing, take my phone out, write those 5 words, put the context in, and then sort of work on it or look at it the next day. It's really a great thing to have that sort of device available to writers. It's changed the way that I have written actually.
Wow, that's interesting. Our next question is from Neela.
Hi, Akar.
Hi.
My question is about Amnesty International. I'm wondering why, when Amnesty India closed down, I would have expected a bigger reaction, especially where social media is so big. Why didn't we have that kind of reaction when Amnesty India closed down?
I think one reason is that they are still they are still here. So I believe that they are filing their writ in the High Court on tomorrow or the day after. So when I was there, the same thing had actually happened, and they came and froze the accounts, and then we sort of moved a writ in the High Court and got it. It took about a couple of months for it to reopen. The expectation is that it may happen again, but the possibility is that it might not. So I think at that point you might see a stronger reaction. But I think one thing is that the narrative of the state has been quite strong on the human rights space in India for about 30 years. So the idea that human rights work is in some ways anti-national and detrimental to the country is fairly widely held, not just in the state, but also in parts of the media. I think this is different than it used to be 40, 50 years ago, where a lot of the print media, there was no TV then, like a lot of the print media was sort of essentially urban and liberal. That's not the case anymore. I think the idea that there is a national interest that all of us have to march behind is much more strongly held in our time.
The next question is from Nisha.
Hi, this is not Nisha. Can Akar see me?
Yes, I can.
This is Anis here. Hi.
Hi, Anis.
That's my wife's name. I'm using her account. So I had a couple of questions for Akar. First was, I loved reading your translation of Manto. I forget the name of the book
It's called Why I
exactly.
Write. Yeah.
But
yeah.
Some parts, yeah, Why I Write. Thank you. So some parts of it feel a little jagged. Was that again a direct translation from Manto's Hindustani to English? Like sentences are a little jagged, like they feel rough at the edges.
I think that might have been, it can't have been him. I think he was quite polished in the way that he communicated. And I think that the translator is to blame if in sort of instances, especially of very short form writing, there is a jaggedness. It could be the case. I have no memory of any parts of the work that were, particularly bad. It was the case that he was either really good in a really good space writing, and many of you will know what that is when the words come out very freely and you're not making any kind of effort. And there were times in his life when he wrote a lot of rubbish as well. So I think I'm not quite sure which of the two this falls into. I tried to pick out most of the stuff that was actually interesting. So if it read poorly, that's probably me to blame.
Okay. And the second question was about outlining. So like you've talked about research and so on. I gather you're working on mainly non-fiction projects, but how do you go about taking the research and going from the research to like visualizing the book and then going about drafting it out?
So for me, because it's non-fiction, it's pretty sort of straightforward. You're laying out an argument. So let's say the argument, and it has to be an argument that you can communicate in one line. So let's say my argument is that all of South Asia is majoritarian, but India is unique in the way that it became majoritarian. So that is, let's say that's the broad argument. Once that argument is, once you sort of internalize it and you believe it, you have to try and convince the reader first that what you're saying is right. And I'll repeat what I said about that speech, that I tell the reader what I'm going to tell the reader, then I tell the reader, and at the end I tell the reader what I told the reader. So you lay out the argument in as simple of a manner as you can, and then you prove the argument. How do you prove the argument? You have to prove it in various parts of society. So through law, through action, and so on. So the structure becomes clear. You make an argument and you prove an argument. That's usually how a non-fiction works. Fiction works in the same way in some sense, but in a very different context. So for all non-fiction, what I said would be a good way to put together a project. Figure out what the argument is. It should be simple. It should be simply communicable, and then prove it.
And how would you change?
One thing I'll add here is,
fiction?
Sorry?
How would you change that for fiction? Like you said, it's broadly the same.
I have no idea. I'd be very bad at writing fiction. Okay. I think fiction is more difficult to do than non-fiction. It requires more imagination. It requires you to put yourself out much more. You can't write fiction out of material that is completely fictional. There has to be some element of you and the people you've met and you engaged with and you fought and you've loved, and it's not easy for all writers to do that. It's not easy for all writers to be perceptive of what the other person wants. I think novelists are very good at being able to read what it is that the other person wants. Most of us are really selfish. You know what you want and how to say it, but how is it that the other person responds? Novel writing requires you to be empathetic, not only in the sense that you feel the empathy, but you are alert to what the empathy means and what changes there are. I don't have that talent. I suspect that for a novel you would need to have a narrative, a thread that is either say a chronological or psychological, and then you try and fill in the bits. There's a wonderful book that Aristotle wrote called Poetics, which says that all fiction writing has to follow this particular classical path. It's about 50 pages long. If you guys have the time, you should go through it.
Sapan, I'll make you a panelist now, so please do go ahead and ask questions. And
good evening.
Yeah. Yeah, what I had a question, probably part of that question was already asked by a fellow colleague. What I wanted to ask was, see, most of the times when I read your piece, generally you have an opinion which is a little bit contrary to the current dispensation of the larger majority. Now, in that way, does that put additional pressure on you? Because now you know that the moment my piece comes out, a larger part of the population is going to junk it, or maybe argue against it, or maybe, you know, whatever way you want to put it. Does that make you more pressurized or more alert to make a more convincing argument? How do you go about it? The more important thing is the process that goes in your mindset.
I think my own writing has become quite boring over the years. That once I became older and was less willing either sort of intellectually or morally to put myself out as much, it became quite dreary. I don't reread any of my own columns, even the ones I wrote yesterday, most of the time. I don't think the job of the writer is to convince, because you're not writing to like let's say Lenin writing something or Marx writing something is very different from you and I writing something. We don't have a social agenda beyond a very broad one. You know, we are not trying to foment a revolution. We're not trying to get people to act on the basis of what we have written. The third book that I'm writing is actually on how you can act. What are the things that you can do if you want to be an activist, even an armchair activist, and how to do that. But for most of us, I think trying to convince large numbers of people is not going to be possible, and you won't know. If you are published in the mainstream media, let's say it's the Times of India, it's got something like 50 lakh readers. How do you know how many of them read it, or like how many of them disagreed? Of the 75 comments that came in, you know, under that paper of 400 or like, you know, whatever else, that's not a large enough sample. So I think you shouldn't be focused too much on trying to convince large sets of people. What you should be focused on is whether you are convinced by what you're saying. I think that's the most important bit. If you're writing non-fiction, I think trying to figure out what your moral path is and trying to hold that is to me much more important and sort of easier to do than trying to convince a lot of people.
Siddhant had a question, so we'll now go over to Siddhant.
Hello, Akar.
Hi.
Well, I think I read your tweet saying you are writing 2 books on Hindutva and the Modi years, respectively. So while writing them, you must have had to engage with propaganda. How do you approach it when writing, or how do you approach the writing, especially when looking at propaganda in a historical sense?
I think you have to be honest. So on the shelves that are behind me, there are 5 or 6 volumes of the history of the Janasangh that the BJP published 20 years ago. So I just looked at it and I reproduced, and I sort of internalized what they were trying to say and then trying to respond to it. I don't think that the writer should be particularly wary of being drawn into the propaganda. It is the case, and I think that that's the point you're trying to make, that it's not that easy to be able to write very strong polemical pieces when you're robustly engaged with what the other side is saying. You can write a pretty angry, a screamy piece while not listening to the other side very easily. It's difficult to write a sort of 105,000 word book where you've read everything that the other side has written and you're trying to respond to it. Fortunately for me, the other side has written such rubbish that it's not that difficult either to distance yourself. I mean, it's nonsense. The kind of pseudo-scientific stuff that they've based their theories on it's appalling that nobody's picked it out first. I think that one of the problems is that we don't have enough writers. I'm hoping that this class produces people who go out and in whatever form put out the stuff that they are able to gather on social media, on Facebook, in newspapers, in columns, and in books. We don't have enough writing. There is no serious sort of analysis of so many things in India, and it requires to be done. I would love it if we had like 10 times the number of writers that we do today. The bizarre thing is that when I was your age, the biggest novelists in this country were people with names like Sheldon and Wallace and Woodhouse, the fact these people who've come out in the last 20 years, this is unique. The fact that somebody like a Bhagat, or I'm speaking obviously in English. There were people in Hindi and in Gujarati, but there weren't enough writers. We didn't have enough fiction writers who were sort of good enough to be able to, I guess, get mass sales. So I'm really hoping that in the non-fiction space, the same thing happens.
On that subject, I'd like to add. I asked the question because right now I'm very interested in how. So Awadh historically was a region where the power was in the hands of the Muslim elite, and how RSS spread here during the 30s and the 40s. So in your book on Hindutva, do you go that far in the past, or
no? I begin.
Or do you place any importance in that?
I'm not a scholar of that part, a part of India. I've looked at it mostly through a constitutional law. So these are wide open subjects. A lot of the things that you just said might be represented in some fashion in an OUP book that would have been published with, let's say, a print run of 300 copies, which is normal. A lot of these academic works that are hallowed, that they only have 500 copies, 1,000 copies, of which half are never read. It is important that if you are moved by a subject, whatever that subject might be, in your case, it is that part of North India, that you spend some time and see what it is that you can put together. It's relatively easy to know what has been done in the past. These days now with Google, it's very, very easy to know what are the books that are actually available. And you can sort of isolate and identify a theme for your own book fairly easily. Good luck with that. Should you push for it?
And there was another submitted question by Shreya, and she's not here right now, so I'll ask it on her behalf. This is from Shreya Jayaraman. What are your must-read books that have influenced your life and choices?
I wouldn't say that by must-read, I presume that they are must-reads for me and not for the other person. I don't have such a thing. I think my reading has evolved from being very classical Indian middle-class reading, which is a lot of comics, a lot of P.G. Woodhouse, Blyton, the Hardy Boys kind of thing, up through some of the more classical stuff. Definitely a lot of the popular stuff, Sheldon and Wallace and things like that, James Hadley Chase. But by the time I was 25 or so, maybe 25, I didn't go to college. So I dropped out of school, and then I did a diploma for like a year and a half in textiles. I didn't read like serious stuff till I was 25, and I came into journalism. That's when the reading really started. So I would say that for me, beginning to read nonfiction at the age of 25 was probably the time when I started to evolve both as a reader and to grow as a writer.
Next question is from Gautam.
Akar.
Hi.
Yeah. So I get a chance to put some of my other questions. Two questions. One is, I guess, close to your thing. It is about Surat that I would like to ask. Second is what something you had tweeted about, which was quite close to me. So about Surat, it has been a trading port since centuries. One expect that there to be a natural acceptance to anything new. People coming from all over the world, strange, whatever their own beliefs and systems. Instead, what we see is ghettoism settling in very early. Zoom out to India, which we live now today. We see we have got Marathi Manus movements, and then in Assam you have got Bodos and all NRCs and all, which are basically arising out of local protection for protectionism and all. So would you say that if you take a long look, xenophilia is bound to be shallow when human beings are concerned, or is there something positive that you can find out? What is the natural thing, do you think?
I think the world is moving towards a liberal space naturally. I think every part of the world is today more liberal than it was 30 years ago, much more liberal than it was 60 years ago, much more liberal than it was a century ago. Every battle that has been fought for human liberty has been won by the people fighting for human liberty. On no war have they lost. If you look at slavery, if you look at the voting rights for women, if you look at gender equality in the workplace, if you look at the rights of the woman to her own body, the movement has been towards the liberal space, towards more liberty for the individual. We might be frustrated by the fact that these changes don't happen before our eyes quickly enough, but the fact is that if you look at, like if you take a longer view of the last century and a half, the battles have all been won. On Surat, I'd say that Surat's success is because of its caste ghettoization. So, Surat's success is because of its conservatism, that there is a conservative mercantilism that a few communities had. The Dowdy Bohras were part of the earlier financiers of the British in the 17th century. The Memons came much later from the west, but the Jains, we used to have this thing called the Nagar Shet. So because they were successful in that space, they remained ghettoized because they felt, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, I don't know, that their success came out of their own conservatism. That if they followed a certain specific set of rules, whether they were caste rules or whatever other rules, success would come, and it did come for them. Surat was fortunate because it was also the sort of the largest revenue earning city because it was the port. But one thing which kept it ghettoized for a very long, my mother lived in a place called Shidmatani Sheri, which is where only patidars lived. So it was very caste based, and a lot of that old part of the city was like that, and it had remained like that for 400 years, or 500 years even. They would see it as a sign of success rather than a sign of their ghettoization.
Something which you had tweeted and which was quite close to the second question. You gave us an adjective, the middle class. You gave us the adjective of the Chutia middle class. So, setting the context where we are aspiring writers here, or at least claim to be so, what would it take for you to drop that adjective which you assigned to us as of now?
I think it's not easy. I'll tell you why. So 3% of this country pays tax. So when we use the word middle class, it's wrong. Basically, we are an elite. People who have access to a proper education, to healthcare, to housing, to food, are the minority by far. Most Indians don't have that. So I think the word middle class I used wrongly. I should have said, upper class or something like that, elite. The problem is that then you tend to think of the Ambanis, but that's not what I mean. I just mean those sort of 5 crore people in our major cities who control everything. What would it take for me to not call us that? And I sort of include myself in it, obviously. I don't know. I think a lot would need to change. We have investments in health which are the lowest even in the developing world. We have taken our kids out of the government schools, so we don't care about the quality of those schools anymore. We started flying, so we don't care about the railways anymore. So we are willing to damage this country deeply by focusing only on what it is that we want. Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh don't have an ST bus service. I hope you people know what an ST bus service. Basically, it's a state-run bus service that connects various parts of the state. It doesn't have it because it stopped making a profit. We have no expectation of that from a bullet train or the many airports that we have. Bangalore's got 2 airports. This one's coming up. Delhi's got 3. Bombay's got 2. But the poor person in Chhattisgarh doesn't have a bus service. I'm saying that we don't even debate this. I'm saying that why is that the case? We don't care about we don't care about this country. I think we hold very strong opinions about it, but I don't think we really care about it. And if until that changes, and I don't see that changing, I think that word is actually quite right to use.
So, from your background, you with the NGO Amnesty, how would you say that we cultivate empathy and get involved with our brethren who don't come across in our paths? How do we wash out these sins?
I think the biggest problem is the lack of knowledge. That till I joined an NGO, I didn't know that you could only protest in some parts of the city after giving an application to the police. So when we watch CNN, we see groups of 5 and 6 people holding up placards. Picketing is what they call it, outside some shop or outside some office, and chanting slogans. You can't do that in India. They would put you in jail. The problem is that the Constitution says that you can do it. So Article 19, 1B says that the people have the right to gather peacefully. We don't have that right. We have the right to actually file an application to the police saying, can I gather? And then the police will say, no, you can only gather in certain specified places. The Supreme Court has said that Shaheen Bagh should have been held in Jantar Mantar. I don't know if you guys have been there, but there are protests sitting there for years. The most Gandhian thing that a person can do is to starve, right? This is the Gandhian form of protest. I will harm myself in some way because I want you to correct your behavior. There's nothing more noble than that. I'm not harming you. I'm harming myself. A woman tried to do that. We force-fed her through her nose for 10 years. It's insane that a person like that is not idolized in this country. Instead, she's seen as some sort of enemy. I don't know why we are speaking about this, but anyway, so I think it's knowing what it is that is happening in this country. And for that, maybe we need to leave our bubble. We need to know what laws we have. Jallianwala Bagh happened because there was a law. It's called the Rowlatt Act. What does that act say? It said that without a crime, the state can lock you up. It's called the preventive detention. You haven't done anything wrong. The state thinks you might do something wrong in the future. Every state in India today has 3 or 4 laws like that. Every state, you can be locked. The fact is that the middle class or the upper class doesn't get locked up in them is the only reason why these laws are there. They are not meant for us. They are meant for the other 95% that the state wants to make sure that they are kept under control, and they're kept under control in the most brutal way. But we don't know. I didn't know about this till I was 45 years old, that these laws are there. But I mean, that's my ignorance and my stupidity. I can't blame it on anybody else. We need to be able to go out and sort of engage with our country in slightly more deeper fashion than most of us do, myself included.
And just to sort of underscore what Akar said about privilege and bubbles, just consider the fact that we are all having a Zoom conversation here, and I can guarantee that none of my students are in Kashmir right now, and we've completely normalized the fact that there's been what's been happening there over a year, and writing is one of the, reading the writing of others is one of those ways to break out of your bubble. Otherwise, we just get complacent where we are. The next question is from Deepak.
I just want to check about maybe a little complicated question, but often there are times when there seems to be a lot of backtracking in terms of public policy and the law. One example would be the Juvenile Justice Act or rather the Reformed Juvenile Justice Act, which actually became much worse. Or say, for example, in terms of sometimes what probably best called zombie arguments that have been disproved but coming back into the public sphere anew. One example would be herd immunity, something which in COVID seems to be something that desperately does not work, but which keeps recurring. One in which, say, the Indian government seems to informally take as a road forward. In such times, it can be deeply, a writer can feel deeply cynical or deeply powerless in the face of it. I know you answered this question about the writer's role in change, but is there a difference in how you write at a time when backtracking is something that is almost like a train kind of barreling down the track? And secondly, what is the role? Is there an ethical or a moral imperative to actually look at revisiting arguments even when, say, certain things have been won, when certain rights have been won? How do you prevent this from kind of these zombie arguments from kind of recurring again and again?
I think one of the problems we have in this country and in South Asia, generally speaking, is that legislation is formed very loosely. So there is not enough importance given to the legislator, and bills are not necessarily drafted by the legislators themselves, and certainly not read by the people who vote on them. So whether it's the Juvenile Justice Act or whether it's, death to rapists or whatever else, I think very narrow expressions of what the right thing should be are taken and then in some way drafted into law. The law is quite loose in India, and once you sort of engage with it at depth, you see how badly written a lot of the laws are. What is the writer to do? I think the only thing that you should do, if you have that depth, I think engaging with legislation, laws, and the problems of how the state is functioning, not too many writers can do. You have to be particularly very well read in those spaces. B, you have to, in some sense, have a legal bent of mind. A lot of the best people who work for the non-profits tend to be from legal backgrounds because they tend to understand arguments structurally. And I think some of the best writers tend to be people who have a background in sort of engineering or law rather than people who studied, literature. It's that width that gives you the ability to be able to bring in a solidity. Even if you fail in making any kind of impact, I think it is obligatory, and in some sense, it is inescapable for writers to continue down what they are doing. And I would see us as being, as writing or drafting those dissenting arguments. The court has sent down its argument in favor of the temple or in favor of whatever else. Muslim men are the only community in India who are criminally punished for a civil wrong or divorce. No other community has that. Why? There is not enough debate on this because perhaps there's not enough sort of interest from people who are not Muslim or so on. But it's a very interesting thing to ask yourself why it's happening. Why do you identify one community that receives a criminal punishment for an act that doesn't even happen? The triple talaq is not valid. So the marriage is sort of intact, but you're going to punish the man for saying it anyway, which is weird. It makes no sense. But that's the law we have. What should we do about it? I think we should engage with it and try and figure out why it is that it happens. The best writing, and some of the best writing, I would say, comes out of people who look at very broad society stuff and try and distill it into things that make sense. And we live in possibly the best country to do that. Because we are very unique. You have countries which have great laws which are followed. So you would say Western Europe, you would say for the most part the US, Australasia and so on. You have countries where the law specifies that you have no freedoms and you can't say it. China, etc. We have something which is weird. We have the laws which says you're free, but the practice which says that you're not. So why is that the case? I think there's a great series of books to be written on why that is. Why are we unique in so many ways? But these books are not actually being written. So sorry for sort of touching so tangentially on something you asked very specifically. But I think it's deep and I think it needs to be engaged in this way.
One last follow-up question to that, if I may, is what advice would you have for people who write about scientific rather arguments or about, say, COVID, especially in an era where there's so little trust in and simple argument takes a paragraph while the complex gestation takes longer? I know that
That's
the argument is that long.
No, it's a great question, and I'll tell you what I do. I send my writing, my stuff to people who are smart, who are smarter than me, who I trust, and I tell them to tell me what is bad and wrong in what I'm saying. I don't send it to them saying, "Tell me what you think," because then our relationship might get in the way, and they might say, "Oh, it's great, well done," or whatever. So I'm saying I'm not really, I'm interested in that. Tell me what is bad about what I have written. And I would say that if you are willing to take that kick to the chest, which will come if you ask somebody to be honest with you, and they are honest with you, often it will be the case that the broad structures are that you thought were very broad are actually very shallow. Some stuff that you got wrong will all come back and hit you in the chest. It'll hit you hard. Like, if you've spent a lot of time writing something and somebody you trust says that it's bad, it will hurt, but it's the right thing to do. Whenever you have something meaningful, the only way to validate it is to give it to somebody and say, "Tell me what's wrong."
Great. We have questions now from Bridge, Manmeet, and Pratibha have raised their hands. As Bridge and Pratibha have already asked questions, I think we should give Manmeet a chance. I'll also point out that we all contain multitudes, as does Akar, but the specific session is really about the craft and practice of writing and so on. So I'm, I think Akar's okay with other kinds of questions coming at him and all that, but let's kind of prioritize the questions on writing itself. I'll promote Manmeet to a panelist now.
Thanks, Amit. Hi, Akar.
Hi.
This has been really helpful. I just wanted to go back a little bit to the form of writing that you had talked about in terms of books versus social media. So, what you said about books really surprised me, because I've always thought of long form and books as a place where the reader is more invested in what they're wanting to learn about, because they feel like they are invested in how the discourse goes and what comes from there on. Do you think that social media, in the way that it allows superficial writing and engagement with the subject in one line or two lines, do you think that it promotes polarization and a very extreme form of writing, or a very low commitment form of writing, in terms of just for the sake of writing, and also because the politics of who the listener is hasn't changed just because the form has? Because if we say that more people are being heard, who is it that we're wanting to hear them is still sort of undefined. So do you think that it promotes the polarization, or do you think it's just an evolution in how we're evolving to learn how to talk online?
No, I think it does actually promote it. Social media is a tool. A tool for what? It's a tool to engage with the world. It's also a tool that gives you the opportunity to be able to convince the world. It gives you the opportunity to reach maybe 5 million times as many more people as you would through a book. Any book writer, the greatest writer of books the most popular writer of books in this country, would have only maybe a fifth or even less of their entire readership as a proportion of the people that they can access on their social media. So if your object is social change, if you want to achieve something through your writing, social media is the tool. If Karl Marx were in our world of 2020, he would not be writing big tomes. He would be on Twitter. Why? Because he sought to foment change. He wasn't trying to be a writer. He wanted his writing to achieve something. If Gandhi were there in our times, he would be on Twitter all the time. And the fact that it is shallow is the reason why it gives the opportunity for millions of people to come in. If it were deep, very few people would, because then that would make it tough. But because millions do, that's what gives the writer, if the writer is inclined towards change of some sort, either behavioral change or social change or change of some sort, social media is the right tool. If you're trying to look at something at depth and do not expect that your writing will bring about the change, a book makes more sense. But there is no question to my mind that if you are thinking of yourself as an activist writer, then the place to write is Twitter and not on books.
I think, Akar, I'll add a slight dissenting note, as it were, over here and say that I kind of agree with the thrust of where Manmeet was going, in the sense that we also have to consider the level of engagement that readers have with what they're reading. So if you're reading something on Twitter, you're skimming it in a very shallow way. Like the analogy I'll draw which I've come to realize intimately over a period of time, is that 100,000 downloads or 100,000 listens of my podcast is probably worth more than, say, 10 million views of a video on YouTube, because the engagement is a whole different level. And I've seen that with my listeners, where it's almost a meme that people will buy the books I recommend in each episode and post pictures of that on social media and all of that. And it's true that there aren't that many people who are going to engage, but where I find social media useful is that you can point people to deeper resources and make them interested. But I'm a little skeptical of how much you can really change minds through social media. You can whip up passions through social media, but can you really change minds and satisfy people's urge for depth? So my little dissenting note there.
If I can just add a little bit there, I think the question that I had in mind, and thinking of the example that you give on the seen and the unseen very often, is that was the constitution imposed on the country? Because there was just not enough deep engagement in terms of almost like the Gramscian intellectuals, that this is what we will sort of do and you have to follow it. And sort of that doesn't work out, because then as soon as a mass movement on the opposite side starts, then you can just have it thrown away, because it wasn't deep enough in the first place.
You would find that the constitution was imposed even on the Constituent Assembly for the most part. There are lots of dissents from people wanted cow slaughter to be in the fundamental rights. They didn't want it to be in part 4, by the way. It's bizarre, if you're reading the Constituent Assembly debates, it's absolutely true that the constitution is imposed, but not only on the population, even on the Congress party and on those people who were voting for it.
Yeah, in fact, I had a recent episode with Ripur Daman Singh where, those tensions come to the fore at the time of the First Amendment. Where,
Article 19, yeah.
Yeah. So let's move on now. Again, I see 3 hands.
Can we take 2 more and then I go? I have a TV show that I didn't know about.
Done. No worries. So what I'll do is, Ayush hasn't asked a question yet, so I'll just make Ayush a panelist.
Hi, Akar. Thank you so much for doing this.
Sure.
I was actually very happy to hear you say that India needs a lot more writers, and there are actually very few. But my experience in at least trying to write for publications that would probably engage with readers in India has been that it's not very easy in India. At least I've found it much easier to actually write blogs for a Pakistani newspaper, maybe because they're interested in Indian politics than in Indian publications. So my question was from that point of view, and I think that many here will also be interested in knowing what is the best way of sort of maybe trying to write for publications and basically in that vein.
So I think that it's true that we are a very nepotistic place. We've got the same columnists that we've had for the last 20 years. I've been writing for the same papers, and Shobha's been writing for the Shobha Day, and it's the same voices saying the same things. And the reason is that we are a fairly nepotistic society. It's not easy to break through. What are the ways in which you can? I think one way you can is start writing. And if your only fora is, let's say, Twitter and Facebook, write there. Make sure that the people you believe will be interested in it are made aware of your writing in some way. The good thing about social media is, even if I don't know anybody, if I produce something of quality, there's a reasonably good chance that it will get shared. How do you do that? Something that there is some element of strategy that you need to make here. But the first part of that is to start writing. It doesn't matter whether there is a fora for it or not. Put your words out. If you believe you want to write, if you feel like writing something, bang it out the next morning, send it to people. It's okay for them to not respond. We are not polite enough as a society to say no. So we just don't sort of reply to people. But that's okay. I'm saying keep trying. Getting into the Pakistani space is important. I'm saying that because once you are actually published there, you become legit here as well. So if you have that thing going for you, keep that going. Get yourself noticed in some ways, and you have the tools to do that by being able to spread what it is that you're writing. But it is a nepotistic place. It is a place that where the young are not given as much space as they should, especially in this form of writing, which is seen as some kind of, only the old and the middle-aged should do. But there are some ways in which you can work your way, around that, which is to stay at it, keep writing, use whatever tools you have to try and promote your work.
Thank you, Akar.
Hello, Akar.
Hi.
Thank you very much for your time.
No problem.
I had a very quick question, and I'll ask one of the questions I had. With respect to writing and getting things out, etc. In the West, there is this very strong idea of citizen journalism, which has been taken off. Like that was what Twitter was spearheading. And in India, it seems to have descended down to WhatsApp University essentially. So if you look at your early days in journalism, there was at one point of time that when you put news out there to people, it is backed by some kind of a journalistic ethics or ethos, or your editor does that work for you so that you cannot just put things out there, right? Like the meme that is going around nowadays for the Harshad Mehta Times of India thing. As an individual, where we do not normally have that kind of exposure, etc., how can we plan that? How can we become take that seriously? And when we put things out there, we think in terms of a journalist. What would be your recommendation for that?
There is nothing you need to know. There is nothing that journalism school actually teaches you that is of value. The only thing you need to know is how to compose an argument and how to hold somebody's attention. And that's it. And whether you do that through interesting words, or you add a video, or you add some kind of photographic material, the more you do it, the better you'll get. There is no secret. There is no skill that is required. Writing is the most basic thing for all of us who are literate. Writing is the same thing as thinking and walking and breathing. Writing is exactly the same thing. It's slightly more structured thinking. And the only way in which you can do, should do, and will get better doing this is to do it. Bang out those words if you feel. There are some of us who want to be a writer but don't really know what to write about. I'm not talking. I'm not referring to those people. I'm referring to those people who have something to say but are finding it difficult to express themselves. Right. Those are the people for whom writing as practice makes sense. People who have this romanticized notion of what writing is and wanting to be a writer without having any material will never become writers. It is those people who have the material, who do not know how to communicate it properly at first and learn it in time, who will become.
And in India, do you see this ever taking off? Like for people I consider citizens or journalists, for like Amit himself in the India Uncut days, or right nowadays I follow Gautam Bhatia for his legal inputs. It always seems that either their area of work or they have always been journalistic in some ways.
Anybody who's high quality, either Bhatia, Amit, if you're he did have formal journalistic experience before his blog days, though.
Right.
But if you're of that quality, you will get there's no question that you will be, especially in our time. It's much better now than it was 30 years ago. It's much easier for somebody who does quality work to get noticed and to be circulated by people that they don't know themselves because of the quality of what it is that they're doing.
Thank you very much, Akar. That's very hopeful. Thank you.
Yeah, Akar, thanks so much for your time. And these are really inspiring words to end in as well, because I couldn't agree with you more. I think we live in times where not only, we have creators are gradually getting independent of platforms and can reach out to their audiences directly. And there's really no other way to become a writer except to write. Just write, keep writing. Thank you so much for, joining us and
my pleasure,
answering all our questions patiently.
Thank you very much to all of you who were a part of this.
Great. Thanks a ton. Right. So thank you for tuning in to the first edition of Windowpane. I hope you enjoyed it. And as time goes by, we'll try and get more writers here to share their writing insights with us. Thank you.